Welcome, everyone. We're live for ACDE number 188. There was a ton of stuff on the agenda today. We'll do our best to get through all of it. I wanted to make sure there's a couple small technical things we cover at the very start so that if we get in the Pectra weed for most of the calls, we've at least gone through them. So Charles had a execution APIs PR that he wanted to get attention on, and then Peter had a concern around the minor tip requirement, as we can do the two of them. And then last week, all the L1 client teams got together to work on Interop for Pectra, PureDAS, and Verkle. So I've linked an update that we published on the agenda. I can give a couple minutes overview of what went down there. And then most of the call, we have a bunch of Pectra related things to discuss. So it would probably make sense to start with where we're at on Devnet 0. There were some spec changes done to 2935. I think everything's been merged now, but just want to make sure that we're all on the same page for this. And then a lot of the CFI and proposed EIPs for the fork had some updates, so we can cover all of those. Specifically, the account abstraction stuff around 7702. I know there's like an in-person event happening now that is discussing this too, so there's like a short window on the call where we can discuss this. And then Reth and the DevOps teams both shared what their preferences for the fork scope should be. So hopefully we can wrap up on that, see if we want to make any changes to Pectra's scope. And then lastly, Portal network. So there were some discussions at Interop about history expiry and if and how that would relate to Portal. So Piper is on to give kind of a quick overview of where things are at there. But yes, to kick us off, Charles, are you here? And if so, can you give a bit of context on the return data PR that you have?
Hey, I just got here.
Yeah.
Excuse me. For context, my name is Charles. I'm the lead maintainer of the Viper language, and also I maintain Titanoboa, which is an interpreter for Viper, and also a framework for deploying contracts and interacting with the network. So this I think is like a feature that every framework designer runs into, which is when you ask for ETH get transaction receipt, you don't get the return data. And so I made a pull request to the, what is this called? Execution API specs. And to request that the return data be optionally included in the receipt in the RPC call. I discussed this also with some people from Reth, and they said that this can increase the base cost of the endpoint, and it could, an alternative is to have a separate endpoint like ETH get return data, which gets you the return data, which is a new endpoint, gives you the return data for a transaction. And that also works. I'm not as big of a fan of it because there's some race conditions, like you can get the transaction receipt and then there's a reorg. So when you could call ETH get return data, you get a different return data. Or there's other more practical issues, like usually you're calling ETH get transaction receipt in a retry loop, and then you finally get the receipt and then the server goes down, which is like actually really common among RPC providers. So you get the receipt, but then you have no return data, and then you have to like do another retry loop, and it's just a lot easier if you get everything back in one call. And yeah, I was wondering if I could get some feedback from client teams and like figure out what is reasonable to implement.
Thanks. Anyone have some quick feedback on this? Yeah, Dano?
Basically, optionally stores the revert reason, which is basically the same data as return data, just on a failed call. So it does have the wire to support it, but as is mentioned, it does take more storage data because you got to store all the return data for every single call. And so it is doable, but I'm wondering if the revert reason is a standard API, or if that's just something you basically did at a customer request years ago. So
Also, the way I spec'd it out is like the client is allowed to return nil or null or whatever if it doesn't have the return data or it doesn't feel like recomputing it. So it's like kind of a request to return it on a best efforts basis. And like my hope is that eventually everybody would just start returning it. But there's like an upgrade path.
Okay. Any other comments now, or otherwise, do people want to take this to the PR?
Parity traces, these are non-standard. I mean, right now what everybody does is like they either ask for the parity trace or debug trace transaction, or ETH call resimulation doesn't work because you get the return data. I mean, the state could be different at the end of the block. So that's like yeah, ETH call is like not correct actually. But yeah, the tracers don't work. They're not, or they do work, but every client supports a different version of it. There's a lot of variation between clients in exactly how it returns it. And it, again, suffers from this race condition thing where you like ask for the return data and then, sorry, you ask for the transaction receipt and then you ask for the trace. And then like, honestly, like God knows what you get back. It's just not universally supported.
Got it.
Merrick?
Yeah, so the problem is that clients do not store this data, and clients have this data, but after a processing block, and there is no networking, so we cannot simply add it as other fields. It would require consensus changes, or clients can store it after execution, but only your local client will have that when process the block. So I'm thinking about more effective way than debug trace transaction, and what comes to my mind is, as it was mentioned, if call or parity traces. So yeah.
Yeah, I understand that it's not in the receipt database. So I guess clients would need to like store it in an auxiliary database or something. And it's like, yeah, right, not part of the consensus. But as I already mentioned, there's like issues with the parity trace. Sina says support adding TX level state for ETH call. That also works. But my question is like, why can ETH call return the return data, but not ETH get transaction receipt?
Okay. I guess, yeah, we do have a lot of things to cover today. Does it make sense to continue this conversation on the PR? Because it doesn't seem like there's a clear consensus on like, do we want to implement this and how? Lucas, you want to have a final?
So why if call can return and get transaction receipt might have a problem? Because we are obliged to serve get transaction receipt, but we are not obliged to serve ETH call if we don't have the state, right? So we might, if we prune out the state already, we won't be able to serve ETH call. So that's the reason, right?
Right, but so that's why it's optional in the PR. The client can return nil if it doesn't have the state. Yeah, we can take it offline.
Yeah.
My question is just like, what can we do to like fix this? Because it's like a major thorn for like people who are using RPCs.
So there's a good comment in the chat by like client around just like trying to frame the motivation better in the PR, because it didn't seem as big of an issue reading that than on the call. So yeah, I think now that people are aware, if we can rework the PR a bit, discuss this async there over the next couple of weeks. And yeah, if we need to bring it up on the call again, we can, but hopefully we can resolve this async.
If I can have one last thing,
Yes,
maybe we want ETF call, but for traces that would only return this without doing the big tracing and returning bunch of data, and just returning the result.
Yeah, that was the alternative proposed by the red team, which is ETH get return data, and that also works. Although I prefer the single call workflow, single RPC call workflow.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Charles, for bringing this on. Next up, Peter, you had a thread around the miner tip behavior, and I know there was a lot of back and forth in the chat, in the agenda issue about this. Yeah, do you want to give a bit of context on your original thread and then the conversation that happened? Hopefully Peter's here. We cannot hear you if you are speaking, though. Oh, I think now we can.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, it's really weird. The microphone is using some other. Anyway, here. So I will be kind of short because I don't really think this deserves too much time. Basically, the issue that was brought up is that Geth has pretty much since forever had this notion of controlling the minimum gas price that miners require transactions to have. And in the proof of work pre-1559 world, that was basically all the transaction fees went to the miners, and then miners just chose what they want as a minimum fee. Later, after 1559 was introduced, most of the fees were burned, but 1559 still has this notion of a miner tip or a priority fee, which goes to the miner. And way back then, the suggestion was that we should reduce the tip to something like 1 gigaway because that seemed fair. And basically, everybody, as far as I know, ran with that. And as time passed, merge came. At some point, I'm not entirely sure when, maybe it was the merge or like sooner or later, there was some regression in Geth where this minimum tip enforcement was not passed from whatever subsystem to the miner. So basically, this led to Geth pretty much accepting arbitrary tips for transactions as long as they met the base fee, of course, and of course the tips were all ordered by their magnitude. So if whenever there was some big congestion, the higher tips were always preferred. And probably because of that, we kind of never really saw this bug that smaller tips are also accepted. And a couple of months back, when I was refactoring the transaction pool, I noticed that this tip wasn't really passed to the miner, so I fixed it and we did the release, which all of a sudden, again, started enforcing the minimum 1 gigaway priority fees. Now, the concern was raised that this 1 gigaway is inappropriate and it is causing problems for the network. And which basically for this, my suggestion was that we should bring it up at all CoreDev calls because, yeah, for me, it was kind of a surprise. And the big question is that, so this is kind of a client-specific configuration. So any signer validator can control this via CLI flag. And being just a client configuration, there's zero effect on consensus. However, given that there seems to be an effect on the network itself, I wanted to just bring it up as if the consensus is that this value is inappropriate for whatever reason, then we're more than happy to change it. And before I give the word to anybody else, just one more thing I wanted to bring up is that basically we kind of can easily agree that enforcing 1 gigaway might be too big in the current climate where basically the base fee is around 5 gigaways, so it's not proportional. So I don't really have any issues with lowering this fee. However, I kind of feel that having the local miners accept 0 tips has a thorny other issue where basically MEV miners can take a 0 tip transaction and they have a chance to actually get some money out of it. But naive local validators or local miners do not have MEV extraction, so they can only really rely on the tips to have basically to have a meaningful reward for including a transaction. So whilst I agree that we don't want to mess with market conditions, I think we also should take into account that local validators don't necessarily behave the same way as MEV extractors, and we should somehow pick something that makes sense for both the network's perspective, but also from a local block producer's perspective. Anyway, that's a short thing. So
Thank you. I think Tomas has his hand up first.
Hi, a few things. So I think it's totally fine for Gav to set it one way. It's not unreasonable. I agree that it's clear it was there, it was removed. I remember that from the old times. And it's also reasonable for the local validators to have this set to one way and not accept 0 way transactions. Because then you can, sure, I mean, we avoid spam because base fee is there anyway. But you don't justify the inclusion entirely from the perspective of whoever builds the block. And they put some effort into building the block. Well, when they are validators, they are paid the reward for the block construction. So maybe they're justified for trying to include as many transactions as possible and clean the mempool. So those different views, but I think still Gav can set the default, especially as this is just a default and you can change it to something else. I not necessarily agree towards the negative sentiment toward the entire MEV construction within the context of this conversation. But this is a broader topic, and it might be that we just have slightly different definitions here. But yeah, I'm definitely on Peter's side, but not necessarily also would suggest other clients to apply exactly the same defaults. They may, and it may make sense for Nethermind, but we shouldn't have this in the spec or protocol design. Thanks.
Thank you. Ansgar?
just to
Oh, sorry, yeah, Peter first.
just one very, very quick reaction. Basically, I'm not really looking to have a consensus on how all clients should behave. Rather, I would like Geth not to do anything where it's obviously bad for the network. So it's like the consensus should only be on behavior that's kind of considered healthy for the network, not further specifications.
Got it. Ansgar?
Yeah, specifically on that point, I wanted to say that I don't think that the arguments, I saw them in the kind of discussion in the issue for today, that the concerns around the network health, I don't think are valid. I think basically Geth having a one way or whatever they want default is fine for network health. I just wanted to find out because Barnaby couldn't be on the call today. He looked into this a while ago from one economic point of view, and I'll post his write-up in the chat, where he was basically arguing that basically the rational long-term outcome would be for even for solo builders to set the minimum as low as possible, so like more one way than one way. But again, I think defaults are not hurtful in this case. So if Geth wants to choose a higher default, I think that is reasonable. The only thing I would say in the past with proof of work, the tip was used to also basically account for the timing problems that would be caused. You would release the block, it would have more chance of being uncled like now with the slots. If you build at home, if you solo build a block, they aren't really these timing concerns anymore. They're only really for like MEV extracting.
builders. So it kind of the cost for the builder are lower now. So basically, you'd only have to account for the little bit of extra compute that you're spending on building the block. So there might be an argument to at least lower the default below 1 Gwei. But I don't think there are any network health concerns here.
Thanks. Lucas?
So from the network perspective, right, I don't see how if like let's say 80% of a network is building with MEV, how setting this in clients would help with the network. It will then cause even more of this small blocks followed by full gas blocks from the MEV builders. So unless we get MEV builders on board, or we do something in protocol, then I don't see this as being helpful to the network in any way.
Got it. Fabio?
Okay. So my point is that I would like to see some research on the effect of changing this, even if a coordinated way or just by the staker that decide which is the value to set. Saying that because I see some possible side effect on this, for example, the impact on the burning of the base fee, since could be that there will be less burned fee as a result of users switching to some of the value of the base fee as priority fee. So there will be more inflation in this case. And also, any case, since you have also, if the transaction has a 0 priority fee, it will reduce the amount of the currency. So I would like to see, in case if there are any study about which will be the prevision about that. Thanks.
So I don't think it's I don't think addressing if and how the base fee gets burnt is kind of related to this, because if we send part of the base fee to the miner, it's just like saying, the base fee was that amount lower, and just from like a conceptual perspective, thinking of the tip as this is what the miner gets is is probably the best way to do it. And so yeah, it does feel pretty unrelated to like how much we burn, because yeah.
Yeah, if I can quickly explain better, I mean, if someone has a target of spending 3 gigaway, if we set the priority fee to be 1 gigaway, they will, instead of using a base fee of 3 gigaway, they will use a base fee of 2 gigaway and a priority fee on 1 gigaway. And so there will be less burnt fee. This is one of the possible outcome. I'm not sure of it. For this, I would like to see some research about that.
I think there's already a fair bit of research. I can maybe pull it off after the call, but like when we were working on 1559, we did have a lot of research around like, should we give the base fee to the miners, and if so, how much and whatnot. So at this point, I'm pretty convinced that yeah, whatever we give to the miners is effectively, you can think of it as just having the base fee being that much lower, and it just makes the base fee a less reliable oracle for like supply and demand. Yeah. So yeah, I think anyways, I think it is valuable to like agree on what is the standard tip that we send, and do we want to standardize that, regardless of whether that tip comes from the base fee or if it comes from like the priority fee. Yeah. Ben, I think you have your hand up, and then Peter.
The suggestion on the base fee is because then that's sort of enshrined in the, that's already the oracle price in terms of it's still going to be whatever it's going to be. And then, you can have the priority fee be that, i.e. a priority. Yeah, so that's all. I mean, I don't mean giving all of the base fee, but just like 1% or something, which would encourage the miner to include transactions in the block, because it's going to be hard otherwise to
But I think,
compete
yeah,
with.
that's the whole reason we effectively have the priority fee, is to separate those two concepts. And the way, it's exposed in the transactions is we say, like, what's your priority fee? What's your max fee? And the max fee is effectively what you're saying. The max fee is like, how much is a user willing to pay for their transaction to be included? And then the priority fee is how much are they willing to send to the miner and to get back the difference if the base fee is not high enough. But the max fee per gas is effectively this value already. Yeah.
Yeah, but the miner is getting what, 1/64th of the block reward for building, and
That's,
so you get,
that's a different thing.
yeah, so you get more for testing than block building. But you do get the priority fees on top. And if it's not an enshrined that it's higher than 0, then since most of the blocks is MEV, and MEV does get a value for it, most of the transactions will become 0 fee transactions.
No, because different builders compete through the relay to send the block. And I think, so the question is, given that because we have external MEV, builders can effectively create these 0 tip blocks that pay the validator through some other way. Do we want to enforce a minimum on the network, even if it breaks with this mechanism? I think that's kind of the point Peter was trying to figure out. It's like, even if it is possible to still pay the miner a different way, should the clients have a minimum, and if so, what that minimum should be? I don't know, Peter, does this represent your concern correctly?
Yeah. So basically, if you want to push this to this issue to the very limit, then the worst case scenario that can happen is that, let's say, the base fee goes up and there aren't enough transactions to fill a full block, but there are multiple 0 tip transactions. So basically transactions that pay the base fee, but transactions that give absolutely 0 to the miner. Now, is the miner expected to include those, even though it gets absolutely nothing for it, or is the miner not expected to include those? And this is kind of a philosophical decision, because from one perspective, from the miner's perspective, why would it include anything that pays exactly 0? And from a Ethereum network perspective, I mean, what's the harm in cramming them in if they fit in? And that's why it's not really a very, very clear-cut scenario. And that's why personally I'm leaning towards having a default that's permissive enough to not cause any issues, but not too permissive to really go to this extreme.
So I have a few comments, maybe Peter, for you directly. I think that I see some potential negative effects of that if you take some assumptions. So imagine that everybody runs GAF with these settings that as default one way. They didn't change it, and there's no MEV. Then it means that practically we moved one way of base fee to the priority tip, which simply redirects the burn to the validators. It's not necessarily valuable, problematic, but it also doesn't feel like it makes sense. Now assume that there is 80% running GAF nodes with this setting and 20% running the other client as solo validators with 0 set. Then it means that the GAF validators actually are decreasing the propagation of the transactions that the other validators consider as valid, because the GAF nodes will be discarding those below 1 GUI transactions from the network, and other validators will have less chance of getting the valid transactions propagated.
That is not the case. So way back, that was the case, that gas transaction pool was linked to the fee that the miner was doing, but currently it is not linked. So currently gets basically our transaction pool is enforcing one way to avoid spam. other than that, basically everything gets propagated independent of what you set your miners to.
But the problem is that I think that even if this is not happening, then imagine that all the gaps are running with one-way default, and 100% of the networks is gaps. And then there is potentially attack on the network when you fill the transaction with the zero priority fee transactions that are not discarded by GEF but never included by the validator in the block. So you have practically, and you can set them in a way that they seem like the best paying transactions in the sense of max.
I guess
No,
well, not
if
really,
they're
because the best paying transaction is the priority fee. So Geth's transaction pool always orders everything by the priority fee that it actually pays. So
perfect.
Geth will.
Ignore. So everything addressed. Thanks.
Okay, so I guess it seems like people are generally fine with Geth selling the amount that it wants, even though it's not zero. And yeah, I think at this point probably makes sense to move on to other topics. But is there any last comments on this?
I guess for my takeaway is that if there's nobody sees really a very hard reason for Geth setting it to 0, then we will probably think about this a bit and either set it to 001 or 00, basically either 100th or 1000th of a gig away. I'm not entirely sure which one. The idea is to be basically want a good enough default, and then clients can just go wild with, or node operators can go wild on top.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Thank you for your time.
And I think, yeah, maybe one last thing on that. There were these analyses done during 1559 about what the amount should be based on like the uncle rate and whatnot. So obviously it's probably much lower post merge, but I assume you can do a similar analysis where like, how much the incremental gas usage creates like a risk of being basically uncled. And that might be a way that you can set the value.
Well, personally, I would pick a much simpler heuristic, basically saying that if below some number, basically it just doesn't make sense to have a transaction. I mean, if adding a transaction is going to pay you 0.00000001 cent, then yeah, it just doesn't make sense. So I think we'll try to pick a number where economically it's not a rounding error. It's something that's meaningful, and then people can go from there.
Got it. Perfect. Yeah, thanks for bringing this up. Moving on. So because we're already kind of late in the call, I won't spend too much time on this, but we did have an Interop event with client teams last week. I posted a recap of it on the on the Ethereum Foundation blog, and then linked this on the Awkward Devs agenda. Yeah, there was a lot of progress made on Devnet Zero, Verkle, Peer, DAS, and a bunch of other things. We'll discuss those topics specifically throughout this call and others. Yeah, I think probably makes more sense to just dive into Pectra directly than discuss Interop, unless there's anything else people want to bring up about it. Okay. So next up, I guess on the Pectra front, so on Devnet Zero, we did launch a first version of it during Interop. Yeah, is someone on the DevOps team here to give a quick update on this?
Yeah, so we launched Devnet Zero on the during Interop, and I'll link the spec sheet for Devnet Zero on the in chat in a minute. We have all the clients joined in, but there have been some changes that were already proposed for Devnet 1, so we haven't done intensive testing on, for example, 3074. And we should discuss. Probably we will be doing that async as to all the change sets that will be active from DevNet 0 to DevNet 1, and then do a relaunch once clients are ready. There's one active bug that still needs looking into and fixing, but otherwise the network has in general been stable.
Awesome. Any other comments, thoughts? Okay. So yeah, talking about DevNet 1, it probably makes sense to discuss just what we want the scope of Pectra to be, updates on the different EIPs, and then that will kind of lay the groundwork for DevNet 1. One of the things that did get a bunch of changes during Interop was EIP 2935, which especially with regards to the block hash opcode, it seems like everything has been merged, but were there any outstanding questions or concern around 2935? Okay. Okay, great. So then I think that was the only one with like significant spec changes that happened during Interop. 3074 and 7702 is kind of a whole different EIP, so we can discuss that separately. And so, okay, on the topic of like stuff that's been CFI'd or proposed for the fork, one of the big ones is EOF. So there's been an update shared on that as well, basically by the Solidity team, that they would support it, and Epsilon's shared a proof of concept for Solidity to support it. Does anyone on the call have any questions, comments, concerns about EOF or any specific updates?
Do we have anyone from Solidity here? They said that they had it ready, or that they would be supportive, rather, of EOF.
Daniel, the Solidity lead, posted in the R&D Discord earlier today that their team was very supportive, but I don't think that he can make it on the call. Yeah, I pasted the message in the agenda, but let me just paste it in the Zoom chat here.
Yeah, this is Dano Farron. Sorry, my internet literally just went down, so I missed some of this EOF conversation. Yeah. But the numbers that the Epsilon team put up are better than the numbers I saw with what Solidity had for the big EOF. I was seeing 3 to 5%. We're seeing 6% code size reduction and call gas usage down by 9%, which is bigger numbers than I was hoping for. So I guess, once again, we're asking for EOF to be included in Prague, Bernie Sanders.
Thanks.
Same from the rest side.
I can speak on our progress from the guest side.
Yep.
We had an issue. Basically, I implemented a non-optimal algorithm for the stack verification. And I started implementing the new algorithm, but that also means that basically most of my progress is moot. So I start anew. It's almost implemented, but it fails basically like half of the tests. The spec still isn't in a place where I would say it would be easy to implement for someone that starts from nothing. I think at this point, no other client starts from nothing. So basically everyone has at least something implemented. For us, it's still a pretty long way to go to be feature complete. But even then, I'm not super convinced that our implementation is actually correct, or will be correct, because it's such a huge change and has a lot of edge cases. And as I said during Interop, I only implemented it. like I just took the spec and tried to implement it. I have not really thought about what I'm actually implementing. So from the breakout rooms I was in, also the one yesterday, I believe, it feels like the Epsilon team and Charles and I guess Dano have really thought about the implications of changing the opcodes in the way they are changed. So, but yeah, I don't, at this point, I cannot say if this is like if they missed something or not. At this point, I kind of have to believe them that they made the right decisions for all of the changes that they are proposing. It kind of depends on when we are trying to schedule Pectra, but from my point of view, adding EOF would definitely delay the Pectra fork, which I don't like, but that's just my personal opinion. That's it.
Thanks. Charles, yeah, I assume this is related to EOF.
Yeah. I posted my kind of current position on EOF in the Ethereum Magician thread. Basically, I've been helping out and contributing to the spec the last year or two, and I'm supportive of anything that improves EVM execution. There's a couple spots in the spec which I think could still be improved if we had more time. I think that the format would be improved if we use variable length quantities, which I've been going on about for the last few months, because it's more future-proof. And I guess the consensus currently is that we don't have enough time to change the format at all, and kind of just want to make it known that I raise this as a concern, so that when we can't, or it's hard to upgrade, you have to allow larger code in the future. Yeah, it could be an issue. The other thing is that UF by design, which is, it's a bit deeper, UF by design doesn't have the same global code section design as EIP 2315. So it necessarily forces the compiler to make some trade-offs. And with some recent improvements to the validation and analysis spec, they're not that large, but they are trade-offs. And I think ideally this could use some more thinking. I also think that EOF is nice, like quality of life things, a lot of really nice quality of life things. I think that Solidity is seeing, really good improvements, partially because UF has things that are specifically, or kind of targeted towards Solidity's codegen, actually. And my position is, I think it would be nice to have a dedicated UF fork or something, so that there's a little bit more time to finish some of these things. I also think, I see your hand up, and I'm guessing, that, I can already hear Deno saying, we can't get everything perfect and we need to ship it. But I think that user safety, and I've been pushing a lot on recent ACD calls for either non-reentrant opcode or improvements to transient storage pricing. And these are user safety things that I think should also be in Pectra. And if there's a conflict between these, I would prefer to see EOF go in its own fork, and we're able to get transient storage pricing improvements sooner.
Thanks. Yeah, then I know you have your hand up, but I do want to make sure we get through the rest. And assuming we move forward with EOF, we'll discuss the specifics later. The other big one that's been heavily iterated on in the past couple of weeks is EIP 7702, which is meant as a replacement for 3074. So 3074 is still sort of what it's officially included in the fork, but it does seem like there's been growing consensus around 7702 from both the people who supported 3074 and the people who had issues with it. Yeah, I don't know. I know Ansgar, Vitalik, Litecoin, the three of you had been working on this. I don't know if either of you can give an update on where things are at. And yeah, can take it from there.
Yeah, I mean, I can give a quick update. Just so basically, there have been some discussions over the last while at Interop and in different other places on the internet as well, and there's been some iteration on the EIP. I think right now Light Client has a PR pending with updates to the EIP. I can link that in chat in a sec. Here we go. And so basically, I can briefly go the current variant of the EIP. So basically, you would specify the address of the implementation you want to use for your account in the transaction body, not the code itself. You would also sign over that address. It would not run any init code at the beginning of the transaction, just copy the code in that address over. Chain ID would be possible to specify but optional. Nonce would be possible to specify but optional. There would be no opcode restrictions, including no restrictions on self-destruct and including no restrictions on storage rights, meaning that storage would also be persistent after the end of the transaction. And for now, there would be no initial permanent upgrade capability, so no flag or anything from the start at least, to have the code persist in the EOA after the end of the transaction. Although, of course, the idea would be to add that at a later fork. There have been, like, some of these are pretty uncontroversial. Some other ones are still, like, there's pretty active conversation on. I'm not sure to what extent it makes sense to have that conversation live here on allCodeFs. But so basically, for example, to mention Draw from the 437 team, I've seen be quite vocal about saying that we should have chain ID commitments be mandatory instead of basically optional. And also, I remember having some conversations with the Aragon team, specifically around them preferring to have a more explicit split of versions that are revocable, or like basically are committing to nonce and chain ID versus the ones that are not. So we could basically have two completely separate signature types. One of them basically for a version that is with nonce and with chain ID mandatory, and one version that is basically completely without nonce and chain ID. That way we could have a more clean split. So these are like still some of the questions that are a little bit in flux, but we are overall converging more and more onto like a specific version of this EIP. Oh, yeah, that's kind of my take.
Thank you. Anyone else have thoughts? Oh, Andrew?
Yeah, that's what we discussed at the Interop. So there are several scenarios how this EIP can be used. If it's a milestone towards permanently migrating to a smart contract, then it makes sense to have non-revocable signatures. But also this EIP can be used for more ephemeral things like batch transactions or sponsored transactions. And in that scenario, you want to play safely and have revocability. So yes, we discussed with Ansgar, it would be good to have two types of signatures, like one very generic without nonce and chain ID, and the other with a chain ID and nonce, to separate those two use cases. And I think I would replace 3074 with this 7702 in Pectra, but I would only certify it until we agree on the revocability design, because to my mind that's very important, and I don't want to commit to this EAP like 100% until the revocability question is resolved.
Thanks. Ahmad?
Yeah, just to clarify, when he said version signature, because Marius asked on chat, this means that there will be two magics for this type of message and message signature. One magic will mean that it has a nonce, because nonce cannot start with 0, whereas the other magic will have no nonce. So one magic with nonce, none magic without nonce. So if someone wants to sign something without a nonce, they can do that. And if they want to specify the nonce, they can do that as well. And with chain ID, we decided to go with 0 for not specifying a chain ID, and a number for specifying a chain ID. And like this gives maximum flexibility to the developers to implement multiple patterns at the same time, allowing the user to have all the security guarantees that it would like to, that he like the users that they would like to have on their accounts. Yeah.
Thanks. Daniel?
Yeah, I just wanted to to add something to what Andrew said regarding the revocability. So I initially was also very much against not having revocability in the EIP, but after some feedback from the MetaMask team, it seems they feel confident that they can still manage the security of the user funds without it. So they, for example, are talking with other wallet providers to implement some sort of like a permissioning system. I think they also want to do something like adding like modular permissions on the, I think similar to 43C7. So before we are adding maybe more complexity to the EIP, by adding more functionality, we also should seek feedback from the wallet teams if they think that's a good idea or not, or if this is something that they will use. Because the worst case would be that we are adding complexity to the protocol, and afterwards nobody's using it anyways. So I think we should do this first before we make decisions on our own.
Got it. Thanks. Do Vitalik and then Andrew again.
Yeah, I mean, I think one important consideration to keep in mind is that a lot of the revocability and chain ID considerations regarding 7702 are extremely similar to the ones for 374, which makes sense because the whole design rationale for 7702 is to basically be a something that provides the functionality that's very parallel to 3074, but in a more like smart contract forward compatible way. And so given that, I think it's just valuable to remember that like there has been existing discussion about the like trade-offs that has very similar reasoning, and like the switch of EIPs that we're pushing is not a reason to like restart that discussion from 0. And there's value in revisiting things that have already been discussed over the last couple of years.
Yes. Andrew, do you have another comment, or was your hand still up?
Yes, I do. So I totally agree that we should check with wallet providers that it's feasible and for them, and they're happy with it. But I am a bit worried that if we decide to rely exclusively on wallet providers for revocability or whitelisting or whatnot, my preference is to have something built in the protocol instead of relying on only relying on wallet providers.
And can someone please remind me what we did for 3074? Like, did we not have this trust assumption? Oh, right. Okay, the nonce increment. Got it. Thanks. Derek?
Yeah. I think in 3074, the last finalized version says that every time you increment the nonce, you'll be revoking all the outstanding auth messages, right? But I do want to remind everyone that in our last call, and also just like in all the conversations that have happened since the last call, I think like all the stakeholders, like all the relevant parties, like whether it's like the core devs or the 4337 authors or the wallet teams such as MetaMask, as well as like the 4337 account builders such as myself, I think we are all aligned that it's very important to support the long-standing authorization use case, right? It's very important to make sure that it's not the case that like every time the user makes a transaction, that like all outstanding revocations, I mean, that all outstanding authorizations will be revoked. I think like everyone has already aligned on that, whether it's like in the last call or like in the subsequent online conversations. That is very important. That's because like some of like the most powerful use cases of account extraction, whether it's like adding new signers to your accounts, or whether it's things like transaction delegation, permissions, session keys. Those all depend on having a way to keep authorizations alive despite the user sending transactions. So I think like the only thing that we are not aligned on right now is like the mechanism that enables that, right? So I think like there's proposals for things like introducing like a max nonce mechanism, or like there's the proposal that I think that Matt made in the latest updates about introducing like optional, basically just like making nonce optional. So personally, I'm fine with whatever, but I just want to suggest again that like all the relevant stakeholders have already expressed that it's very important to enable the long-standing auth use cases. Yeah.
Thank you. Let's do Vitalik and then Eric.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is starting to get a bit zoomed in, but one thing that's important to also think about is like there is a particular way of using 7702 that some people have in mind for some of these longstanding things, which is basically that wallets only ever sign one message, where the one section message is permitting a standardized proxy. And then the intention is for like any use case that's not like literally ephemeral could just be built on top of that, and the proxy would have its own upgrading mechanism. So I think one of the side questions that's worth discussing is basically like to what extent there is alignment on that approach, right? Because if there is, then like yes, like making complete unrevocability becomes something that's much safer. But then, like if not, then there's more discussion. But I mean, I think in general, right, this is definitely starting to get into some of the rabbit hole areas, and so I think as a meta point, like realistically, it's this stuff is going to get resolved through like one or two breakouts. And not through like getting everyone to agree on things in the next 5 minutes of this ACD.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. I guess one thing, so I think, one thing is we should schedule a breakout to like get this resolved. It is worth highlighting that like if we can't get to a solution, then like the sort of status quo outcome is we don't ship anything. So I guess, maybe one thing to figure out is just when we want to have this breakout. I know there's some in-person meetings happening in the next week or so on this stuff. So if someone who has like context on the whole 7702 discussion can propose some like appropriate times for a breakout on Discord, that would be great. We should ideally have a final spec before the next all-core devs. I think if we don't, then it becomes very hard to actually include this in the EIP. And then, there's 2 comments in the chat now about this. Like, it seems like everyone would be in favor of swapping 3074 for 7702, assuming we have a final spec. I don't know if we're like finalized enough to include 7702 in implementations now, but does anyone oppose removing 3074 CFIing 7702, and then on the next call, we can potentially include 7702 if we have a spec. And yeah, I guess to Ansgar's point, like okay, so people would rather not remove until we switch over. And I guess I think it was Aragon who raised the concerns with the revocation. Like on your end, Aragon, would you prefer to like include this and remove it at a future date if we don't find a final spec, so that we can actually get started on the implementations?
Yeah, from my point of view, it's fine to CFI it and start working on it and include it into the next DevNet. But yeah, I mean, if we fail to find a solution dramatically, yeah, then later we should exclude it.
Okay, so I think then what this would look like is CFI 7702, include it in DevNet 1, and then remove 3074, and assume that yeah, we can figure out the issues with 7702 for now. Yeah. Okay, and there's a final proposal by Justin, is like keep both right now. Is it simpler for client teams to keep both in the next DevNet, or is it simpler to just do 7702?
Can we discuss it async?
Yeah, okay. Well, I guess, yes, let's move forward with 7702.
So just one small thing. We didn't actually test 3074 and Devnet 0 because Perry forbid me to do it because we were so afraid that the Devnet will completely break. So I would propose removing 3074 so we can just go wild with the fuzzer and test.
Okay, so let's do that. Let's remove 3074.
I had to nerf my.
Oh, sorry, were you gonna say something else?
Nope.
Okay, remove 3074, add 7702, have have that part of the next DevNet, and then and create basically have a breakout in the next 2 weeks to iron out the spec issues. And I think, Ansgar, to your last comment, and based on the Aragon stuff, it's probably simpler to CFI 7702 and then include it once the spec issues are finished, but we also have it as part of DevNet 1. That feels like the best compromise to move forward, actually get the work done, and also make sure we have a final spec that people are happy with before we commit to it further. Anything else on this before we move forward? Okay. Thanks everyone for all the thoughts and comments here. Yeah, so please, Ansgar, like client, someone else, figure out the time to schedule the AA breakout or the 7702 breakout based on the burn-in meetings. But we should aim to have all this wrapped up before the next All Core Devs. Yes. Okay, and then there's 3 other EIPs that had updates that are a bit shorter. So if we can get through those in like 5 minutes, hopefully we can then spend some time discussing the fork scoping. So 7623, Tony, are you on the call?
Yes, I am.
Yes.
I will be very quick. So 7623, the latest update included reducing the gas cost from 12.48 to 10.40. This would mean that even less users are impacted. Talking with people, it feels like there is some demand to ship that in Pectra. Maybe we can do that already in the next DevNet because it's a rather small change. There were some discussions on Eve magicians. So Martin from Gev also voiced that concern about this weird market that it might create. But yeah, we could resolve those concerns. And Martin is now also for the EAP.
Awesome, thanks. Any question Otherwise, we'll move on to the next one. Okay, the other one is 7212, the RIP/EIP with the R1 precompile. I forget who was supposed to give an update on this.
Hello, I will give the update and I will be very quick for that. And I wanted to remind the current situation about the RIP. As you remember, the IP has moved to an RIP status and be implemented by some of the rollups, and it has been CFI'd to ACDs before, and I will be talk about the current rollups that implemented and also talk about the current client implementations. I'm also posting at the chat. Recently, Polygon has gone to mainnet with this precompiled contract, and zk-sync is on testnet and will be very soon on mainnet. And in Optimism and OP stack rollups, including Base and Kakarot, zk EVM has merged to their repos, and Arbitrum is on governance to implement the proposal in the next hard fork. And in the client implementations, Get, Aragon, Besu, and Red client implementations are ready, and Polygon and the other optimistic rollups are using this reference implementation. Aragon is following this implementation and also used it on the Polygon. And I have just seen that Besu has a draft PR about the issue, and I think it's also ready, and Red implementation has been worked on Ethereum fellowship, and I guess it's also ready. And I have just seen that Nethermind team is currently working on this EIP, and I'm not aware of any implementation in Ethereum JS. And that's all I want to mention for now. And if there are any questions about current status or CFI status, I would love to answer them.
Okay, thank you. Okay, and I guess last one was SSZ's. I don't think Idan is on the call, but he posted, he posted an update on the agenda. I don't know if anyone has any questions, comments about it. Yeah, Cayman?
I can just...
Yeah, I think this makes sense to discuss more in the context of increasing the scope or not increasing the scope of the fork. So I think we should delay that, delay the discussion until then.
Okay, so I guess, yeah, that is the next thing on the agenda. And maybe to start this, so I know Rhett put together a document with a bunch of different options, and then the DevOps team as well. So maybe, yeah, maybe Rhett, you want to start, and then we'll hear from DevOps and go from there.
Yep. So I'll share the doc in the Zoom chat in case people haven't read it. I would appreciate if people would have a chance to read it the next time we have such a conversation. I'm trying to answer 3 simple questions, which is: when do we ship Prague? If we ship Prague later on, should we extend the scope? And B and C, if we choose to extend the scope, what should we include? And I think the first topic that I would like to discuss is, should we ship it 2024 or should we ship it Q1 2025? In my experience, people haven't been shipping hard forks in Novembers and Decembers, in particular because in December people go on vacation, and this time because people will be in DevCon, and my understanding was that people don't want to be doing work while they're at DevCon. Now, I don't know. I'm just raising that into presence. I know that we ship when ready. That's how definitely we ship. So if people are down for that, sure. But, you know, like, just bear that in mind. And my understanding is that indeed people don't want to be fixing a consensus issue at DevCon. So I'm just caveating that. And beyond that, my thinking is that if we were not to ship it in 2024, Basically, if there is any kind of scope change allowed, there is room for one very, very important thing, that is PeerDAS. I'm not an SEL developer, and we don't run a CL team. We do know that demand is arriving, and we do know that the EL and CL updates are coupled as EIP 4844 is defined right now. What does this mean? It means that there's no room for a CL only hard fork from the EL, because the EL has a constant that says the blob count. So if you want to do a blob count increase, you need to do it on the CL and the EL, and that's a problem. The final thing on why I think on why PeerDAS is important here versus just increasing the blob count is that, and somebody from CL should confirm that, is that due to how 4844 works and how blobs and the block proposal or attestation are coupled, there's already high bandwidth requirements, so there's some blocking that happens during the CL process. And even if you increase blobs, you wouldn't be able to have a solo staker or a low resources node operator to be able to not miss slots. So it seems like a problem in any case to increase blobs, and it seems like it's worth including PeerDAS to get around that. And to the extent that we do that for CL, it gives us plenty of time to also do it on EL. And in that case, there's a question of, okay, what should go then? And then we would pitch the scope for EOF, which we think deserves a whole conversation for it, and we wish we had time. So that's where we're at. So the TLDR is let's ship Crag in Q1. On the CL side, let's do PeerDAS. On the EL side, let's do EOF, including whatever else we've talked about for 7702. And I would love to also hear the EF DevOps take on this. From our point of view, small fork is kind of a meme. I don't know that this has happened properly ever. So it seems worth being present to that and not saying it as something we could do. It seems worth being very explicit about what our expectations are here.
Thank you. And yeah, before we hear from the DevOps team, I will plus one the small fork comment. Like there's a couple chat comments of we can do just a quick fork with PeerDAS and EOF before Verco or Osaka. Then we should just call that thing Osaka and assume that we've agreed to do more work and separate it into a separate fork. And if it ships quicker, great. But it's probably a bad process to assume we would only do this work if it's a quote unquote quick fork. Barnabas or Perry from the DevOps side?
Yeah, I can go. So we've also posted our thoughts on what we on what the fork could look like. And I think one of the differences is that we just wanted to define all of the options that we thought were viable, and then towards the end, just specify which option we prefer. But also want to caveat that we as a team could not even come to consensus as to what option we prefer. So yeah, take that with what you will. I'll just start with a bit of thoughts and concerns that we had, as well as counterpoints to them. The first one is that right now we've been looking at most EIPs as just testing the single EIP. We haven't necessarily looked into testing the edge cases of one IP with interactions with edge cases of another EIP. A simple example is where changing how deposits work, but we're also changing what a validator is with MaxEB. So we're going to have to stress test both of those edge cases in combination and not just in isolation. So that, I imagine, would increase the scope of testing. But one of the points that Pavam made as a counterpoint to that is that irrespective if we ship it together or if we ship it separately, we're still going to be doing edge case testing. So it doesn't make a difference if it's in one fork or over two forks. I think me personally, I would prefer it in two forks purely to reduce the risk. But I think that comes into the mega fork versus the smaller fork discussion again. Another point that we wanted to bring up was that in all of the discussion so far, we haven't included EIP 44s. I don't know what the status is of that, if it's happening fully out of protocol, if there's some sections in protocol and out of protocol. And I think we also should be aware of how many research efforts we have that we want to ship. So if there's a subset of the team working on 44s, a subset working on Verkle, a subset working on PeerDAS, that's a lot of subsets for small teams. Yeah. And like Ansgar said, we just wanted to put all the options out there and see what people thought, and then use it as a starting point for a discussion.
Yeah, thank you. This is really helpful. Yeah, any other teams aside from DevOps Ret has thoughts on how we should approach this?
From the red side, we generally defer to the DevOps team as the testers here. Yeah, I think we've said we've shared our view in writing.
Yeah, in general, I would say that UF as it stands now could be even shipped in 2024 because it took just 2 months to implement it. I know there is a lot of testing that needs to be done. Some of the tests are already written, but EVM as the component that's well defined already have testing suites and frameworks that we can reuse. So I think the framing that UF is the big change and it will take like a year to implement is not correct because I heard some discussions that relate to that.
So I don't know if it's like a year, but there's some comments by Geth about like it would not ship in 2024. And I think, yeah, like obviously we have many clients, but like, yeah, we have many clients and we need kind of them all to ship the fork. So yeah, so I think, we should assume if we do EOF, then we are probably delaying past 2024. And, it's great if we are quicker than expected and we ship in 2024, but usually we're actually slower than we expect with these things. Andrew?
Yeah, so I think if we include EOF into Pectra, it will realistically delay it by maybe 3 months. And
got it.
But I'd like to say that it's better if we decide it either on this call or the next one, because we need to plan our Pectra work. So we shouldn't like prolong it indefinitely, the decision.
Yeah. Thanks.
Just said for discussion, both the GET and Arigo don't have implementation. So it's just estimation that they're giving that UF is going to push Prague for 2025. It's like it does increase the scope, but in my opinion, it's not that big.
Got it. Let's do Jacek and then Guillaume.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention 2 things. One is for a stable container, which basically, the way we were thinking about it in Kenya was that we could introduce it for the things that already change. This would be good for users because they only need to perform one smart contract upgrade then, and then in the future they can have their proofs and everything forwards compatible. So that's kind of like a stable container light way of including it in Pectra. For 4.4s, the way I think about it at least is that a lot of it we can ship without a hard fork, including experimental testnets and things like this. So I think it's worthwhile to start working on it now. Ship the parts that are shippable without a hard fork. And then when it's stable, we can formally include, user documentation, basically that the network, all the nodes on the network will no longer be holding block history.
Got it. Yeah, Guillaume?
Yeah, that's actually not a bad EOF. I mean, I do think, the rest of the guest team, that is going to push stuff to 2025. Traditionally, we have done the testing, but I would say that's not a reason per se to stop EOF. The question I had, because something you said, Tim, did you just say that you were already considering moving Osaka yet Verkle yet another fork? That's something that wasn't clear to me
What I
from what
said
you
is
said.
that if the decision is there should be a fork after Pectra that has PeerDAS and EOF, we shouldn't call it Pectra 2 and lie to ourselves that like it's a quick fork and we're going to be able to ship it in 2 months. We should assume that it's going to be another full fork and the consequence will be delaying Verkle. Yes. I think this is like the failure mode we get in when there's more stuff we want to do than what we can actually do. So we, try to like squeeze things between two forks, but effectively they are two real forks, and the naming should reflect that rather than like making us feel better that it's only Pectra 2 and it's not actually Osaka. In practice, it's another fork.
But from what I understand from Perry's proposal, is that he's talking about a CL only fork, which could perfectly cohabit with Verkle, and so whatever doesn't make the cut in Prague should make the cut in Amsterdam instead.
Sure, whatever. I guess my point is much more, if we have something on the EL between now and the next fork, we should just call that the next fork. It doesn't matter what it is. We just shouldn't assume that we can just sneak in mini forks between forks, because that's just realistically not going to happen. Andrew, and then there's you, Alex.
I think between Verkle and EOF, I think Verkle is more important, and we already committed to shipping Verkle in Osaka. So if we don't include EOF into Pectra, I don't think that we should have kind of a Pectra 2 fork. Then we should postpone EOF to Amsterdam.
Yeah, thanks. Alex?
Yeah, sorry if the mic is a bit noisy. It's kind of connected to what Andrew said. I kind of feel like this group on Onco has maybe a tiny bit less visibility on the application layer and more kind of benefits people using the EVM could feel with something like EOF. Obviously, all the discussions here are extremely important and tackle different parts. But I kind of feel like maybe the visibility of developers' experiences is less understood by this group. And I do have a question, because I kind of feel like what Andrew said, if EOF right now wouldn't be included in Pectra, then I don't really see that it would ever be included, because then having another fork with EOF, there wouldn't be just like a 1 or 2 or 3 month delay to Pectra. That would be a full fork with however many months that takes, and that in that case that would extremely delay Verkle. Because of that, I kind of feel like this is the only opportunity to really introduce EOF. Maybe at the cost of 1 or 2 or 3 months delays. I don't think it would be introduced otherwise. And I do feel that we have really good momentum right now with all the implementations. So it feels like this is the correct time to do it. I think that's my summary.
Thanks. I do want to make sure we keep at least a couple of minutes for Piper, so we can do Guillaume and then Marius, and then wrap this up, and have a few minutes to at least talk about the history expiry.
Yeah, so I'll be quick. I think doing it doesn't matter when you do EOF. Either EOF is important and adds value, which I think it does. The REST team, for example, in Kenya has made a fairly compelling point about what they want to do to achieve with it. So I don't think that if you don't schedule EOF in Prague, it kills EOF. Because if that was the case, then EOF is pointless, which I'm convinced it's not.
Thanks. Marius?
I wanted to say exactly the same thing. If we think this is the only time that EOF can ever happen, then it's not a good feature, and we should just drop it. There's no point in shipping something if we're not convinced that we can also ship it 6 months later and it's still important. So yeah, do with that whatever you want. But I also think EOF is a good feature, and it should be shipped at some point. I do like the thesis of doing it on L2s first. They can do it right now because they have the code, because we are writing the code for them. So I don't really see the argument of L2s cannot build this because we basically built this for them already. So they could roll it out if they wanted to.
Okay, I guess it does. Yeah, it doesn't seem like we're going to resolve all of this in the next 2 minutes. I think, as I said in the chat, like pure DAS feels like the most significant bit here, and it'd be valuable to discuss on the CL call next week how we want to prioritize pure DAS and or just like a normal blob increase, and then kind of structure everything else based out of there. Assuming we do that, it would be really valuable for teams to think through, the different options that the DevOps teams put out, and other options potentially of what they want to prioritize, so that on next week's CL call we can make a decision about pure DAS, blob counts, and whatnot, and then use this to inform what we do on the EL side. It does feel like there's not a burning desire. There's not like the same level of urgency, I guess, on anything EL related than there is on potentially the blob count. And yeah, Giorgio's Dragon, if you can put your comments in the chat, just because I want to make sure we leave at least a couple minutes for the history expiry stuff. Yeah, sorry about that, but yeah, TLDR, I think teams thinking about this in the next week, discussing on the CL call next week, specifically related to pure DAS and what that implies. And then 2 weeks from now on ACDE, we make a final call about the scope of Pectra from the EL side. And in the meantime, teams can obviously work on Devnet 1, which would include the same EIPs as we had, modulo the 3074 7702 switch. Yeah. Piper?
Everybody, how's my mic?
Great, thanks.
Been playing catch up this last week since I wasn't there for the breakout on 4.4s and history expiry. Been looking over all the notes and documents and trying to find out, what happened there and where what EL teams are interested in. We're excited to collaborate with you guys on this. In the notes and things that I've seen a lot of description of a minimal portal spec, and I'm curious if anybody has anything specific that they've identified in our spec that they are, wanting to cut out. And I haven't gotten anything specific yet. And if there isn't anything specific, I'm wondering if we can stop using that terminology. I'm pretty sure that our history specification does exactly what you guys want it to do. My questions, I guess, are kind of like, what do EL teams need from us to move forward with this? We're definitely like here and ready to answer questions, ready to, show EL teams around, that sort of thing. There's documents posted in the history expiry channel on the R&D Discord. I encourage you guys to take a look at those. If you're on an EL team and you're going to be heading up implementation of this, I encourage you to come say hello to, our client teams and things like that, and introduce yourself. Let us know what team you're working on or what client you work on. And we are having an in-person event next week in Prague, May 28th through May 30th. And if you are going to be diving into some of this stuff and you are able to make it to that, it would be a great way to onboard fast. If you'd like to come, please DM me on Telegram or wherever, and I can get you guys added to that. And I know we're mostly out of time here, but if there's any questions or anything around this that anybody wants to raise, I'm here for that.
Thank you. Yeah, we are already a minute past time, but yeah, Jacek and then Andrew, we can do your comments and then wrap up.
Yeah, so when we talked about minimal, we talked about the block history and not so much the other components like client and state. So that's what minimal refers to, like just the block history.
So we already do this in our specs, and so there's nothing that actually needs to be cut or changed for clients to be able to implement only history. So that is supported in the existing network and client designs.
Yeah, and the discussion was mainly around the light client protocol as well, whether that is a dependency or not, and it's not really from an execution client's point of view. It's more if you're running a full portal node that doesn't have access to any other consensus mechanism.
Thanks. Andrew?
Yeah, I just had the same comment as that we want some kind of mini portal spec for block history only, because as I understood, Vitalik's worry is that we don't want to rely exclusively on archive nodes for block history. So as far as I understood, the idea is that non-archive nodes commit to store a certain chunk of block history via the mini portal thingy.
Yeah, our specs are history data, like the history network is history data only. There is no minification that needs to happen here. We don't do transaction hash lookups in that network. It is strictly block history. And to the best of my knowledge, it does exactly what you guys want it to be. So we can keep talking about it, but the concept of like a minified version of the spec, I'm wondering if we can drop that language unless somebody has something specific in our specs that they've identified that is that's extra. So, looking forward to answering more questions. We're here and ready for it. We got a network ready for you guys.
So we already kind of have like a networking layer, and as far as I understand, Portal is built on a different networking stack. Do we need this different networking stack to be implemented in full nodes in order to join, or would it make sense for Portal to adopt the current networking stack that we have?
Portal does not work on Dev P2P. You need a DHT for this. And it is why we've built on the networking stack that we have built on. Building it on a fundamentally different network stack is going to require somebody to come in and solve a whole bunch of problems. So if somebody else really wants to do that work, they can, but that isn't Portal.
Thanks. Okay, I think this is a good spot to wrap up. We're already a few minutes over time. Thank you, Piper, for coming on. Thanks, everybody, for all the conversation. And again, I'll emphasize, like, please try to think through the scoping for the fork in the next week so that we can have a good discussion on PeerDAS and everything else on the CL call, and then finalize the scope on the EL side on the next ACDE. Yeah, that's it for today. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Tim.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Yeah.